morning. This lecture video is going to go over cartilage and the properties of cartilage and then talk about the two ways that bone can form: intramembranous ossification and endochondral ossification. Let's start with cartilage. Cartilage is going to be part of the skeletal system. It's a special tissue, a type of connective tissue. There are three types of cartilage found in our body. There's hyaline cartilage. These are located in your epithelial plates, so along those lines in your long bones where growth occurs, articular surfaces in your respiratory structures, fibrocartilage, which is between your vertebrae, and then elastic cartilage, which is your ear and your epiglottis. And you can kind of see fibrous cartilage, the cells are going to be much more widely dispersed. Hyaline cartilage is kind of in between, and then elastic cartilage, the cells are a little bit more packed together. Cartilage cells are called chondro, so either chondroblasts or chondrocytes. So chondroblasts are going to be those cells that make the matrix. So the matrix is, just like in a bone, is going to be all of the surrounding material around an actual cartilage cell, which is the chondrocyte. So here's a chondrocyte, and then chondroblast is going to make all of the filler or the material that surrounds each of those sites. There's also a perichondrium in cartilage, which is a layer of connective tissue that kind of covers it, that kind of sits on top there. All cartilage cells are going to come from a stem cell called a mesenchymal cell. So those mesenchymal cells will actually specialize into cartilage cells, either chondroblasts or chondrocytes. And again, here's a picture. Here's hyaline cartilage. We have to identify those under the microscope. Here are the chondrocytes. And then the matrix is all of this surrounding it. This is a fibrocartilage. This is elastic cartilage, same thing. So just so that you see that cells in connective tissue or cartilage are going to be surrounded by matrix, and the chondroblasts are going to make the matrix. The chondrocytes are going to be the active cells in them. So let's talk about bone development, or how bones form, not development, but formation. So bone is really a replacement tissue. And what that means is that it actually uses a model tissue or a different kind of tissue on which to lay down its mineral matrix. For skeletal development, the most common template is going to be a cartilage one, which is why we talked about the cartilage in the previous slides. Basically, during fetal development, so when the baby's in the womb, a flexible semi-solid matrix that's produced by chondroblasts is going to form. And that matrix includes collagen fibers, it includes water. And as that matrix surrounds and isolates chondroblasts, they become chondrocytes. So just like osteoblasts and osteocytes, chondrocytes are going to be cartilage cells surrounded by that matrix. Unlike the other types of connective tissue, cartilage is avascular, which means that it does not have a blood supply to it. So it only can receive and remove waste through diffusion in that matrix. So the nutrients in that matrix will just enter into the cell, and waste products in those cells will exit out of the cell into the matrix. So it does not have a blood supply. And that's why when you damage your cartilage, it doesn't repair itself as readily as other tissues do. So back to fetal development. When that baby is growing and then into childhood growth and development, bone will form in that cartilaginous matrix. And by the time that fetus is born, most of the cartilage has been replaced with bone, but some of the cartilage will continue to turn into bone throughout childhood. And even some cartilage will remain in your bodies until through your adulthood. There are two types of ways that bone form them, both involving some cartilage. The first is intramembranous ossification. And what this is that this is when compact and spongy bone develop directly from sheets of connective tissue. Basically sheets of those mesenchymal cells that we talked about. So remember, those were the cells that would eventually turn into cartilage. There will be sheets of these cells that bone will develop directly on. So these, typically the bones of your face, almost all of your cranial bones, your collarbone or your clavicle, these are all going to form using this particular process. There are 4 steps to this process. So step 1 is those mesenchymal cells will group into clusters, and those clusters then are going to be called ossification centers. So here is an ossification center, and they are formed by these clusters of mesenchymal cells. These mesenchymal cells then, or these ossification centers, are going to contain osteoblasts. Those osteoblasts are going to secrete matrix and surround themselves with collagen fibers, becoming osteocytes. And when that osteocyte then forms, it is going to start creating the trabeculae. So basically a spongy bone network. And the periosteum is going to start to form. That trabeculae will continue to fill in then through the activities of the osteocytes in order to produce compact bone. And the compact bone will just develop right on top of that spongy bone matrix. So you can see how this works in the diagram. So we had this ossification center, those osteocytes and osteoblasts. The osteoblasts will become surrounded by the matrix, becoming osteocytes. Those osteocytes will then start to form the spongy bone, so the trabeculae here. And then eventually that trabeculae is going to start to harden through the activity of those osteocytes in order to form compact bone. So we started with mesenchymal cells, we went to osteoblasts, we went to osteocytes, we went to spongy bone, we went to compact bone. And so that is one way that bone formation takes place. Intramembranous ossification begins during fetal development, and this will continue all the way through into adolescence. The last bones to ossify via this method are the flat bones of the face, which will reach their adult size at the end of an adolescent growth spurt. So this is kind of going to allow bones to grow through puberty until we are finished growing. The next type of bone growth is called endochondral ossification. In endochondral ossification, bone develops by replacing hyaline cartilage. So unlike the other one where it forms over the matrix of the mesenchymal cells, this is actually going to make cartilage, and then the bone will actually replace the cartilage. The cartilage does not become bone though. Instead, that cartilage serves as a template to be completely replaced by new bone. So endochondral ossification actually takes a lot longer than intramembranous ossification, and bones on the base of the skull and our long bones in our arms and legs, fingers and toes, these are all going to form via endochondral ossification. So looking at a long bone, for example, at about 6 to 8 weeks after fertilization or after conception, some of the mesenchymal cells are going to differentiate into chondrocytes, so cartilage cells. And that's going to form a cartilaginous skeleton that will be the precursor or kind of the template for the bones. Soon after, the perichondrium, which is that membrane, remember, that covers the cartilage, is going to start to appear. As more matrix is produced, the chondrocytes in the center of the cartilaginous model is going to grow in size. As the matrix starts to calcify, nutrients can no longer reach the chondrocytes, and this results in them dying, right? They can't get the food that they need, and they end up disintegrating into the surrounding cartilage. This allows blood vessels to come in and invade that resulting space, and this is going to cause the cavity to actually get bigger. And it's also going to bring osteogenic cells to the area. And remember, those osteogenic cells are going to make osteoblasts, right? Which is what we want. Those osteoblasts then will secrete a matrix, surround themselves by that matrix, and produce osteocytes, which are the cells that we need to make bone. You can kind of see how this happens. So here's a hyaline cartilage model. There'll be a primary ossification center that takes place here. So this will become from the mesenchymal cells, the cartilage model of the future bony skeleton, and the perichondrium will start to form. That's here in letter B. Then we will get capillaries that will kind of penetrate into the cartilage to bring nutrients in and form a primary ossification center. Then, letter D, we will have cartilage and chondrocytes that will continue to grow at the end of the bone. Secondary ossification sites will start to develop, and then the bone will end up being replaced again by osteoblasts and osteocytes. However, cartilage will remain at the epithelial growth plate and on the end, so the epithelial growth plate here, and as articular cartilage, that will stay in order for it to allow bones to grow, and then that articular cartilage will allow to reduce the friction in between the bones. So that is endochondral ossification. So intermembranous is formed by a sheet of mesenchymal cells. Endochondral ossification is the formation of cartilage that will eventually be replaced by bone. So how do bones grow in length? That's the last thing that we need to talk about. So the epithelial plate, remember, is going to be where bone growth occurs in our long bones. It's a layer of hyaline cartilage, and this is going to be where ossification occurs. So the epithelial plate is composed of 4 zones of cells and activities. So here are our zones: reserve, proliferatory, hypertrophic, and calcification zone. The reserve zone, so this one up here, is the region closest to the epithelial end of the plate, and it contains chondrocytes, so these are the chondrocytes, within the matrix. We got matrix, we got chondrocytes. Now remember, this is cartilage, so that's why we're talking about chondrocytes. These chondrocytes do not participate in bone growth, but what they do is they secure the epithelial plate to the bone tissue of the epiphysis. So they're kind of like the anchor. It's the anchor area to anchor it to the bone. In the proliferative zone, it's the next layer towards the diaphysis. Okay, so this would be going towards the shaft of the bone. It's going to contain stacks of chondrocytes, and its job is to make new chondrocytes, so going through the cell cycle and mitosis, to replace those chondrocytes that die at the diaphysis end of the plate. So its job is to make new chondrocytes. Chondrocytes in the next layer, which is called the zone of maturation and hypertrophy, are older and larger than those in the proliferatory zone. So these cells here are more mature. They're situated closer to the diaphysis end of the plate. And longitudinal, or bone growth in length, is going to be a result of the cellular division in this particular zone and the maturation or the maturing of those cells in the zone, in the hypertrophic zone. So these are going to divide and reproduce more cells, and then these are going to be those cells that have aged and matured. And so bone growth is going to be in length done because of the activity really in these 2 layers. Making new cells, having those cells mature. Again, we're still talking about chondrocytes here. We're still talking about cartilage cells. So most of the chondrocytes in the calcification zone, which is the zone closest to the diaphysis or the shaft, are dead because the matrix around them is going to start to calcify. It's going to harden. So capillaries and osteoblasts from the diaphysis here are going to penetrate into this zone, and then those osteoblasts are going to start secreting bone matrix, where again those salts will accumulate along that matrix and start to form hardened bone. And so bone growth in length occurs when this osseous or this bone tissue is going to be added to the diaphysis down below. Bones will continue to grow in length until early adulthood, and how fast those bone growth is really controlled by hormones, which we'll talk about in a different lecture video. When the chondrocytes in this epithelial plate here stop going through mitosis and stop replacing themselves, the bone will eventually obviously replace all of these areas and bone growth will stop. So that's how bones grow in length. all really from the activity of cartilage cells, chondrocytes, until the very end when those cells die and osteoblasts take over and start making a matrix. So that is how bone develops from either mesenchymal cells or cartilage, and then how your bones grow in length.